Good afternoon. Whoa, sorry. Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to BELIV. We're going to be starting our second paper session for the workshop. My name is Mariah Meyer, and I'm at Linköping University. And I'm really excited about the set of papers we have. We're going to start with a couple of online talks to begin with. And grab my notes. So our first talk of this session is going to be by Katrine Angerbauer, and they're going to be talking about, get that back, they're going to be talking about their paper on Toward Inclusiveness and Accessibility in Visualization Research, Speculations on Challenges, Solution Strategies, and Calls for Action, and it's one of our position papers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katrin Angerbauer, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Stuttgart. And I'm really happy to be here today at BELIV, and I'm going to be presenting our position paper as that I wrote together with Michael Sedelmeier. Okay, terminology first. Here we use the terms of accessibility and inclusion in the context of people with disabilities. And we're interested in the questions how to make technology and particular visualization accessible to people with disabilities, and how to include them in the design and evaluation process. Of course, this is not easy, so we're reporting mostly the challenges in our position paper, and we also discuss potential solutions. We outline calls for actions, and as I was born with a mobility disability myself, we also I discuss a bit about my personal experience with accessibility, and in particular the lack thereof. But before we go to a visualization, let's talk a bit about general challenges. You might recognize some of them also from the keynote earlier. First of all, there's a lack of disabled voices in academia. Why? Well, because there's an access differential, so disabled scholars have to put in substantially more work to be successful. And even in accessibility research, there's still a lot of work from the ableist perspective, where non-disabled people are considered to be the norm to be compared against. And this effectively silences disabled voices. So how could we provide equal opportunities for disabled scholars? This is not an easy question, and in fact, this goes far beyond visualization research, of course. We need more fundamental systemic changes within academia to provide equal opportunities for all. But I wanted just to mention it here for the sake of completeness, because I think many issues that we're facing on a lower level are also related to those systemic challenges we face. And from a personal perspective, let me tell you that those access differentials are actually real, and I have to put in sometimes a lot of work to get where I want to be, and workarounds are often necessary. But I'm really grateful that nowadays we also have hybrid conferences and so on, because with a mobility disability, traveling is not always that easy, and it's good to have that option. Yeah, and well-meaning accessibility research can easily turn into parachute research, where we end up accidentally exploiting communities for publication's sake, and this also results in solutions that are not actually helping people with disabilities, because we're solving different problems compared to those problems they're having. And the disability advocate Liz Jackson coined this nice term, disability dongles, for that. As a potential solution, we have to reinspect our design frameworks and go from this empathy-driven being like someone to actually being with someone. and really listen to the experiences and share experiences together. And furthermore, there is no hierarchy between the disabled and the designer. So I'm disabled and I'm a designer as well. So there should be no hierarchies. And we also should critically self-reflect on the social impact of our research, as also the keynote mentioned earlier. From a personal perspective, again, I consider my disability to be part of my identity, and it's nothing really to be fixed. So I don't need stair climbing wheelchairs, a perfect example for a disability dongle. But I need an environment where I can move freely without stairs. That's just enough. So finally, to the challenges within visualization. Currently, we don't have clear definitions yet what are accessible visualizations, because accessibility is highly individual and we're currently still lacking data sets about accessibility that are ideally created by people with disability. So explaining and defining accessibility is not that easy, which I also discovered in my own projects. And but there are potential solutions. So we could use simulators, but please do so with care, because that should only be the starting point of the conversation. Simulators cannot replace the conversations we're having with people with disability. And there's also these nice heuristics by Ilowski et al. I think he presented them in some other session, which I really recommend to check out. And as a call for action, we need more accessibility data sets, and we should also start or thinking about tools for sharing experiences together so that the perspective exchange is really getting easier. And as a personal note, again, on simulators, you might simulate some aspects of my disability, but you cannot simulate me and my experiences. So if you want to get to the bottom of my accessibility needs, you have to talk to me, and you also have to listen. Of course, when we're designing for visualizations, we don't only design for accessibility. We have other design dimensions we want to fit, and this often could cause tensions. And for example, simple visualizations, according to related work and also some of our experience, is more accessible, but designers do not often want to sacrifice that information richness for accessibility. And also accessible solutions might not be considered as aesthetical. So for example, texture could be considered also as visual clutter, where while it's essential for some. How to deal with those tensions? We could consider, or we should consider, accessibility from the start as one of our central design dimensions. And as a call for actions, we need to investigate more what these trade-offs actually are to be acting accordingly on them. And again, a personal note, accessibility is not always attractive, but believe me, it is necessary, and in the end, it will also be beneficial. With that, I'm already at the discussion and conclusion. When we want to solve inclusion and accessibility issues, we need to do it holistically. This is a big thing to do. I acknowledge that, but we could start by getting aware of the bias we're living with, and eventually ask ourselves the questions: who would benefit from our research and who not? And is this disadvantage intentional, or are we accidentally propagating some biases that we actually wanted to fix? And at the lower level, we need to say goodbye to the one size fits all solution. And I think lots of creativity is required to fit diverse needs. And lastly, but most importantly, we need to understand accessibility and inclusion in the first place. So what does accessibility mean in specific use cases for specific people, for specific tasks? What are the trade-offs we're facing, and where are the limits? For me, as a takeaway, perspective exchange and the sharing of lived experience is the key of fostering inclusion. And showing different perspectives on things is something that visualization is really good at. And so we're in an excellent position to start developing a toolbox for that exchange. And I hope we will be doing so. Thank you.
I think we're going to have Katrina back up for the Q&A. Great, thanks. So thanks so much for that nice talk and the paper. And I just want to, I didn't mention this before, so just as a reminder, please post any questions that you have in the Slido, and we'll make sure to try to get those answered. So just to kick things off, I have a question for you. There was a really interesting talk yesterday in the Viz for Social Good workshop where someone was presenting ideas around how do we represent people using iconography and glyphs and things like that, and sort of challenging how the sort of many of the ways that we do it is very like dehumanizing. So sort of wondering from your perspective, what do you see as opportunities for visualization to sort of do a better job or to offer new perspectives when people are actually looking at data sets that include information around accessibility needs and things like that?
Well, for starters, we could, if we're evaluating things and if we're having people provide multiple perspectives if we're evaluating things. So if somebody has problems and it's just one person, it might be interesting in the accessibility perspective to even look at that one person, the data of that one person, for example. And if we're going to visualizations in mixed reality, for example, that there the sharing of experiences maybe even gets easier, but even accessibility even gets harder because interaction is also a bit harder in mixed reality, maybe for people with disabilities. So it's all a tricky thing to do, but
Great, thanks. So we have a question here on Slido. In accessibility research, there's often talk of the quote unquote curb cutting effect, where accommodations produce benefits for everyone, not just those with a disability. What are some potential curb cutting benefits you could envision with more accessible and inclusive visualization design?
Well, for example, so we're there's this chart where somebody is also situationally impaired, for example. So if you're currently sitting far away in the conference room, we all benefit from better readable visualizations, and in the end I think our world gets more hectic and diverse. So if we're producing better readable visualizations, that might be beneficial for all eventually. Even if you have visualizations in AR again, so that the real world is pretty busy, and if we're manage to focus on the most essential parts here, which is also relevant for people with disability, to have clear readable visualizations, that could help.
Great. And one more, just very quick question. So you mentioned you mentioned that the conference being in hybrid, you're able to participate remotely, and that you appreciated that. If there is like one thing that you could recommend for the conference to consider to continue to improve its access of the research community to people with accessibility needs, what would that one thing be that you would wish for more of?
Well, continue offering those hybrid conferences, even though it's a hassle, I know, because hybrid always has its hiccups. But if we would switch, for example, to totally in person again, which is also great, by the way, but that then we would lose maybe people that could not travel, or if you for example, get sick at the last minute, then you could participate virtually. That's also a huge benefit, for example. So again, the curb cutting effect.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that input. Wonderful. So let's thank Katrine again. All right. Our next speaker is also going to be virtual. So the next talk is going to be given by Dimitar Garkov, and they're going to be talking on research data curation in visualization.
One moment.
I think we're going to need some sound. So we're going to have to hold on a second there. We don't have the sound yet from your Zoom feed. Can you say something?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We need the sound from your Zoom video.
Let me check. Not sure how.
Is this a setting in Zoom? Is it a Zoom setting?
Yeah, sound. I found it.
Who does? He does?
My name is Dimitar Garkov.
The video.
There we go.
Research data curation.
Let me restart it. And
My name is Dimitar Garkov, and today I'm going to present to you our paper, Research data curation in visualization. I'd like to thank my colleague and all members from both research
Can you guys hear
centers.
that okay? No.
I'm fully prepared.
Let's see. Yeah, we just couldn't quite. It was very, very, very quiet. It doesn't sound like your sound is going through Zoom.
okay.
Okay, yeah, we can try that.
Yeah. You check.
My name is Dimitar Garkov, and today I'm going to present to you our paper, Research data curation in visualization. I'd like to thank my colleagues and all members from both research centers. Research data curation is carefully preparing research data for sharing and long-term digital preservation. Thus, data management and data curation make up two sides of the same coin. Centered around the data repository, here the data repository of the University of Stuttgart, DARUS, with the long-term goal of fostering outreach, trust in the scientific field, and of course, research repeatability. Here, we see the overview of publication, curation, and research repeatability, and each of these has its own pipeline. And for the research pipeline, we see that there are different types of data. Data can be either produced or reused, and produced data can then be not only any collected or generated data, but also data from the research activity itself. And once all this data is produced, then the authors become producers and depositors to curate and, as the name suggests, deposit the data in a data repository, wherein data quality and formal policy compliance are ensured through a two-step review process. Of course, depending on the geography, there might be other roles. But here, as I've mentioned, research repeatability several times by now. A bit more detail on that. So this is a common term describing both reproducibility and replicability, where for reproducibility, the inputs are identical, thus resulting in identical outputs of those two different research pipelines. Then for replicability, the outcomes are consistent, however, this time for identical research questions and or hypotheses. And here, we cannot seem but notice that the visualization community is lagging behind other fields. And in this admittedly not very nice visualization, we see a wheat plot where we have binned the different venues according to their data requirements policies of this year on their website. And here we can see that the majority really don't have any specific policy to this end on their website. And the slight offset is indicative of slight additional measures which are either positive, such as giving badges, or negative, limiting the admissible size of the data that can be provided. And we also searched the registry of research data repositories for the terms visualization, visual analytics, visual computing, and InfoVis, and found no dedicated repository. This is unlike in some other fields where they do rely on visualization but have their own dedicated repositories. For instance, in astronomy, in atmospheric science, in oceanography, and we sort of try to answer what could be the reasons for those apparent challenges. And there are basically two types of reasons, historic and thematic. On the historic side, there have been research projects on enormous scale that have driven naturally research data management and curation. And in the life sciences, then, because of data reuse, development of new software, and the creation of computational models, mechanisms and systems have also emerged and resulted in various well-known databases, in specific data repositories, or certain initiatives like Combine. And then a step further, in neuroscience, there has even been a push toward sharing complete computational environments. And on the right side, we have the thematic reasons, where we begin with research data, which is seen rather as a means to an end, oftentimes provided by domain scientists, because in this case, the visualization research is not rather interested in the collected data, but in the whole visualization process. And then for software, providing open source software, which is also one type of data, we always send up Slack, and when this software is released, then the means for that is normally the system paper, and this makes it harder, requiring extensive comparison between state-of-the-art and existing systems, in increasing number and complexity. Then when we next think about qualitative data, then a perfectly valid question is, does qualitative data and open access go hand in hand? Because you could very well have the case where an economically high effort is put on researchers because of the need to anonymize and translate, if it is a foreign language, in order to have data sanitized for open access sharing. And then, as I've said, in other fields, there are certain journals that require open access data publishing even prior to peer review, and also certain type of journals, for example, focused on software. And here, in the next few minutes, I would share some of the lessons we have learned from our hands-on experience. First is considering the first lesson is considering open access. This is possible by default and by design in DAOs, and datasets are also versioned and can be always validated. However, access in itself, if needed, can also be restricted. Lesson number 2 goes to show that data, in order to facilitate research repeatability, because each step in the research pipeline bears importance to the next, can be structured in such a way, and this is done quite easily in the case of DAOs, simply by archive upload. And this brings us to the next lesson, which is lesson number 3. There we advise researchers to begin curation of the data and preparation for that as the data emerges, and then to begin the publication process, because this is dynamic bilateral process. Once the paper, around the time the paper is finally accepted. And this is because with time, the ability to provide a detailed annotation, which directly affects research repeatability, degrades. However, the opposite can also be true, where too much detail can also hurt understanding. And this is why these reviews are so important, not only for understanding, but overall ensuring data quality. Then in lesson 5, a software snapshot can be provided in order to minimize dependencies. A snapshot is a ready-to-run version of that software. Of course, dependencies cannot be always minimized, and therefore we aim to avoid conflict of guarantees, because external platforms, they rarely provide any long-term guarantees. And this would then be a conflict, for instance, with the promises given to a funding agency. And this is why the DMP is so important. However, preparing the DMP takes time, and it needs to be done ahead of that, during which no research management is not done ahead of time, but more and more projects are requiring that. And therefore, using a template such as Horizon Europe, which is based on guaranteed fair data, is a sensible and really thing to do here. And the fair data principles, of course, refer to findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable data. And lesson 7 tackles the question of having a conflict in licenses, but using a structure as shown previously. One can avoid this between data sales license, which is a Creative Commons, and any of the software licenses. And on that note, I want to conclude and say that yes, curation is achievable, not only for large research projects. With time, we believe that incentives and practices will align. We've seen that also for ourselves. Initially, there has been certain resistance, but with time, we've seen a quick buildup of expertise. And on that note, I want to conclude with our final lesson: do not overdo formal requirements and keep the entry barrier low without sacrificing the value of curated research data. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for that nice talk. All right, so again, just as a reminder, please post any questions you have in Slido. So the first question is, part of your motivation for data curation is repeatability and reproducibility. But what do you think of data curation should look like for qualitative work and other kinds of visualization research where notions of reproducibility are generally of less importance, if they're important at all, that situated ecological validity and applicability might be more important?
So thanks. First, please excuse my voice. I'm battling a curious case of COVID. So I think first and foremost, it is important to have access to the data, and then if that's it, if access should be restricted in some way, the data should still be sort of shared in a limited way. For instance, something through something like Safe Haven use, or just be preserved, so that if there is a request to later replicate or reproduce the study, that the researchers requiring that or requesting that, pardon me, would be able to get their hands on the data and be able to do that, because there have been studies that found that, okay, and this is, for instance, the case in many across disciplines. For instance, it is prevalent that the use of data availability statements, but those statements, they often are just empty promises that later on, when data is requested, that data is not even given to individual researchers. So, and then for qualitative data, yeah, that's just I think even more difficult. But I think we have to put more effort in starting, because there is, for instance, judging from our own experience in both research centers, so far the biggest challenge was just having people provide the data and then sit down, invest effort and time to annotate that with metadata, and this is I think already a step that takes a lot of effort on both sides. And then there are those unique challenges that may require anonymization or translation that, as I said, they lead to just another level of difficulty.
Great, thanks for that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to move on for time. But if other questions, put them in Discord, and I encourage all the speakers to engage in Discord with the lively discussions going on there. So thanks to the speaker one more time. All right, so the next talk in our lineup is going to be by Konstantin Kucher, and he's going to be presenting an interdisciplinary perspective on evaluation and experimental design for visual text analytics.
Hello, good afternoon for you in that time zone. I will try to share a video from VLC. If the sound doesn't work, please write on chat and I should be able to pick it up. Hi, my name is Konstantin Kucher, and I would like to present a position paper on evaluation of visual text analytics on the behalf of my co-authors Nicole Sultanom, Angel Daza, Vasily Kisimaki, Maria Webstead, Barbara Plank, Jean-Daniel Fekete, and Nargis Mayar. Since this is a position paper, we should start with a brief summary and the main point that we are trying to make. In this work, we are focusing on the field of visual text analytics, which combines computational and visual interactive methods for text data. However, there are a number of concerns associated with the messy real-world data used by such approaches, the computational algorithms and models, and the visual representations and interactions. Given all of these issues, our argument for this paper is that design and validation concerns for visual text analytics go beyond the natural language processing community or the information visualization community on its own, and truly interdisciplinary efforts and collaborations are necessary. I should mention that this work results from the Dagstuhl seminar on visual text analytics, which took place in May 2022. It brought together 28 participants with a rather balanced mix of NLP and visualization researchers and practitioners. During the seminar, the participants formed several discussion groups, including the topics of NLP model interpretability, uncertainty and bias in visual text analytics, and so on. One of the discussion groups focused on the issues of evaluation and experimental design of VTA. And the set of participants of that discussion group is precisely the same as the set of authors of this position paper, with a balanced mix of NLP and visualization researchers. As a result of some very serious and intense discussions, we identified a number of issues and challenges on VTA evaluation for further in-depth analysis. We focus specifically on 4 major groups of challenges from this list. First of all, we consider the issues with the data used for VTA approaches, their consequences for traditional NLP evaluation approaches, and the role that interactive visualization tools could play in this regard. Next, we discuss the issues of experimental design of VTA solutions with respect to the underlying data and NLP techniques. The third group of challenges is related to the user trust concerns for VTA solutions, including the issues of trust measurement. Finally, we consider the big picture of VTA evaluation, which is related to the first 3 groups of challenges, but also to the necessity of conducting further systematic analysis of the existing body of work in this area and the potential guidelines for design and evaluation of VTA. So let us start with the data and computational analysis first. To find the common ground within our multidisciplinary group, we had to discuss the use of the term evaluation in the first place, since in the NLP community it is typically associated with model performance measurements based on a specific gold standard or ground truth dataset. We could also notice here that the NLP community makes a stress on essentially the error rate for evaluation purposes. The issue with counting errors in this regard is that the real-world text or language data is rich, ambiguous, and messy, so the notion of a single ground truth for a specific task is quite an oversimplification. Examples could be given here all the way from lower-level analysis, so to speak, up to the levels of semantics and pragmatics. One traditional approach to estimate the quality of annotated text data for a certain task is to compute inter-annotator agreements and use measurements such as Cohen's kappa, for instance. The higher levels of such agreement values, they are expected to indicate higher quality of data. However, this is also an oversimplification, and in-depth analysis of the respective disagreement issues could actually be valuable and could lead to further insights about the underlying phenomena in the data. In this aspect, visual text analytic tools could be helpful for NLP researchers and practitioners. Proceeding further towards the functionality of NLP analysis and also interactive visual representations, we have discussed the experimental design concerns with respect to the following 4 dimensions. First of all, we should consider the users of VTA solutions. And here we could define several user groups, ranging from developers with the highest level of knowledge about the system and the expected functionality, all the way to the general public. Next, we should consider the tasks that would allow the users achieve their goals. The following dimension of scale has to do with peculiarities of the text data, the respective NLP techniques, and also visual representations. Speaking of representations, we should also name data representations as another dimension that might affect the resulting technique design and performance. Moving beyond the design and evaluation of performance and usability, we should also consider the potential errors that NLP models could make given the noisy real-world data, and also the implications of such errors for the user's decisions. The user trust is a crucial factor of the overall performance, usability, and adoption of VTA solutions, which might all be affected negatively if the user relies too much on the model's outputs or does not trust them at all and spends additional time and effort for double-checking such results. Therefore, we would like to urge the research community to take the issues of user trust into account for the VTA design purposes. But we should also mention that measurement or evaluation of user trust for such solutions is an open challenge on its own. Given all of these concerns, from the data and tasks to the NLP and VIS techniques, as well as the user trust considerations, the next challenge that we could name is to come up with an overview of the existing body of work on design and specifically evaluation of visual text analytics. Here we propose a sketch of the complete VTA workflow with the various aspects that could be considered for such a systematic analysis of the existing work. This figure is provided in our paper, and there is certainly a lot to take in from this figure, but the main points, once again, are to consider the users, the NLP concerns, the visualization concerns, and finally, the complete visual text analytic solutions. Based on such future systematic analysis, further guidelines for VTA design and evaluation could be developed. To conclude this presentation, we should state once again that there is definitely interest and potential for mutually beneficial collaborations between NLP and visualization researchers in the scope of VTA evaluation. We would thus like to invite the researchers from both communities to make progress as part of interdisciplinary efforts. That's it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thanks so much for that talk. To sort of kick things off, as someone who has not done a lot of research in NLP but has had projects that have dabbled in it, I'm often quite overwhelmed by just how challenging NLP is. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some really pragmatic next steps that the visual analytics community could take to really help push some of the the challenges you've offered are quite, I think, high level. What do you see as some very pragmatic steps that would be really fruitful steps forward in all this for visual analytics researchers?
Thank you for this very interesting question, Mariah. One of the major themes that we identified, and we partially reflected on that in this position paper, but one of the themes that we identified during our conversations, discussions during that seminar was that a lot of researchers within the NLP community are not really aware to the full extent of the possibilities that visualization and visual analytics could provide. And also, what is the sort of a toolbox that we have? What are the opportunities that we could bring to the table? So in that sense, I believe these further conversations, raising visualization literacy in some sense, and for us also learning more about the terminology, about the traditions, about the toolkits that the NLP researchers use, could be one practical step forward. So continuing to sort of establish this common ground in continuing to educate each other as communities and then trying to make a leap forward together.
Great, thanks for that. And I'm not sure if you saw the paper earlier today on trust, and you had mentioned the challenge of trust with users who are using visual analytics tools and NLP methods, and that it's a very complicated it's a complicated concept to evaluate and consider. And I was just wondering what ideas were sort of tossed around in your group this spring to try to tackle that challenging problem.
Thank you. To be honest, I missed the presentation earlier, but I glanced through the paper and this is definitely something that we will take into account when hopefully continuing further with the efforts in our interdisciplinary group. I would say that looking into these proposed scenarios, including such sort of a trust building games, so to speak, that were mentioned in that paper, I believe, as an exercise, would be one way to think of the possible scenarios, how the concepts of trust are introduced to the stakeholders when such systems are designed, and then continuing to gauge their level of trust in the process of the design and evaluation of the initial implementations of such techniques, but then hopefully also continuing to gauge trust and the consequences of over or under trust in longer term as well.
Great, thanks so much. Let's thank our speaker again. All right, so the next paper in this session is going to be by Michael Carell, and he's going to be presenting his position paper on Are We Making Progress in Visualization Research?
One second. There we go. Right. So as Mariah mentioned, I'm Michael Carell with Tableau Research, and I'm here to talk about progress in visualization. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the title here is sort of a bit of a red herring. Or if you like, it's a bait and switch. It is some sort of fish-related metaphor. But the reason I want to make that initial caveat is, while I do intend for this question to function as a provocation, I want to make sure that we're on the same page about what kind of provocation I mean. So one particular reading, for instance, is I'm asking if you personally are making progress. And I don't think that's necessarily a useful question, at least for a wide group, right? Like, so for one is, I hope the answer is yes, right? Like you're probably learning new things and you're building new things and so on, right? So there's a few versions of asking about progress that are sort of uninteresting to answer, right? Like, yeah, we're getting stuff done, and I certainly hope we're learning things at the individual level. But what I mean is this we, right? This question is whether we as a field are making progress. And that's where I think the answer is, one, less clear-cut, and also where we have more wiggle room. So for this paper, I'm using a definition of scientific progress from philosopher Alexander Bird. And this might sound like kind of a boring definition, right? An episode of science is progressive when at the end there is more knowledge than in the beginning. But I think the implications are important because it means that not all kinds of work count with respect to knowledge, right? So just adding predictive power or measurement precision is not sufficient. You actually need to have produced some knowledge at the end, right? Like if we accurately predict the location of planets, but we still think the Earth is the center of the solar system, then we're in trouble. Right, so that's the knowledge bit that's key, right? Knowledge has to be true for one thing, but the general idea is that you have an existing state of understanding. We do some work, and that can be technical work, experimental work, observational work, or even theoretical, take your pick. And then we have a new understanding at the end. It's important, however, that this work can sometimes go awry, right? So work by itself is not enough to produce knowledge. So some things that can go wrong is this idea of transferability, right? Like if you know something, but you don't bother to tell anybody about it, right? So as an example, this is work by James Hampton, who over 14 years, using things like discarded foil from champagne bottles, built this thing called the Throne of the Third Heaven, right? And nobody knew he built it until he died and they were cleaning out his garage, right? So our knowledge can kind of be like that too. Like it's really cool if you have all of this great expertise in designing visualizations, but if you don't usefully communicate how you do it, or at least train people to do it like you, then when you die or retire, that's it, right? They're cleaning out your garage. And the second thing that can go wrong is that we may not have good reasons to believe what we say we know, sometimes called epistemic luck, and so we can run into trouble, right? So if I just flipped a coin or used a magic 8-ball to answer all of my research questions, I might, be running into trouble. Our justification in this case for believing something is weak, and so we either might very well be wrong, or even if we're right, we just got lucky, right? And luck is something that can run out. And then this last failure mode is called escape. So escape to me is where we've learned new things, but nobody cares, right? It's not useful to anybody who matters. We're just too far away from the real problems. Right, so sure, we want to learn stuff and produce knowledge, but the knowledge we generate should be useful or at least relevant. Okay, so with all of that background in mind, you at least maybe have enough to not initially discount this question of what progress means. Right, so when you hear my provocation, you should think of a few things, right? It's a question about our epistemologies, our methods, our goals, and our values, right? It's a provocation, maybe even existential provocation, but it's not an attack on your individual work or your self-conception. At least I hope not. So I turned to people who have been in the community for a while to try to get them on record around these ideas, around epistemology and values. And this turned out to be kind of difficult. For one, senior visualization researchers are usually very busy, and they have better things to do than to answer questions sent out mostly for idle curiosity. And the other thing is that I was doing this all by myself, right? I was very much in tinfoil artwork in the garage territory. So you should always trust but verify. You can read the responses in less time it takes to read the paper, so I highly recommend it. Right, and these questions that I asked these senior visualization folks were trying to get at the building blocks of progress, right? How do you change things? How have you learned what you've learned? What would you change? And how strong were the methods you used to get at these things? So, and I want to be as candid as possible here. A dozen and change senior people spending a chunk of their afternoon on an online survey does not create a unified epistemology or really unified anything. So I think the right mindset, as I sort of briefly talk about the results, is going to be, think of it, the survey as sort of a psychoanalyst couch, right? What were people worried about? What were their anxieties? So that's what I'm going to be talking about, just very briefly. So the first set of anxieties I want to discuss about is our comparison to other fields. Right, so the folks I interviewed often compared ourselves to fields like psychology, and we were found wanting, right? In our methods, our incentives, and even our outputs. Right, even economics got a couple of kicks in while we were down. We similarly found ourselves lacking rigor in these more qualitative fields, like sociology and anthropology. But I do think it's important to note that these other fields might object to how they were described in these surveys. Right, it's sort of the reason I have this picture from Lacan here is that sometimes when we think of other people, we're really projecting our own egos onto them and thinking what they might think of us, but it's really ourselves reflecting back on us. So when we compare against psychology, what are we comparing against? Probably the psychology in our head. Right. So another set of responses focused on a lack of applicability or operationalization in our work. Right. So this fear of escape that I mentioned earlier. In particular, there was skepticism that we were creating things that were useful to the broader community of practitioners, right? They were building these one-off or bespoke systems instead of engaging with more general problems, or in general sort of falling short of this conception of who we are doing this visualization work for. So these two sources of anxiety together create what I am calling the applied field Ouroboros of stagnation. Copyright, trademark, whatever you want. Right. In maybe sort of a personal angst, right? We're trying to have our cake and eat it too, right? To put off efforts around sort of reform in our methods by running away from the problem, right? Like, so we say, oh, it's okay that our experiments sometimes suck because we're a technical field and we build stuff. But then when we build one-off things that aren't useful for wide audiences, we say, oh, well, that's okay because we're an experimental field and we run studies, right? So using one self-conception of the field to retreat from reform in the other self-conception of the field. I don't think things are as dismal as this slide lays out. I think there's a few ways of avoiding the clutches of the Ouroboros, right? And the most salient, I think, is to really question the idea of the survey itself, right? That we're looking for scientific progress as the end-all be-all, right? Like this idea, what I call naive scientism, which is that the more sciencey something is, the better. Right, and usually by science, we mean this kind of gestalt of like folk theories about mathematical models and quantitative work being better than qualitative work and theorizing and things like that that may have very little to do with the actual scientific method. Right, as many of my respondents pointed out, there's lots of ways to keep busy and produce good and interesting work that don't involve anything like scientific experiments. right? Even if it is desirable as a field to be more sciencey, right? We can't just blindly copy other fields and expect it to work out on our own. And the second form of escape, which I personally find particularly interesting as well, is to sort of find out what our secret sauce is, right? What's the special thing that makes visualization unique and not just applied computer graphics or applied perceptual psychology? From my respondents, they seem to be pointing at something interesting around thinking about how we design and build visualizations, not just in terms of like the visual variables that make them up, but how we use them to think and persuade, right, in societies and organizations rather than individuals. So that's another thing to dig into. That's not just building a thing or running a study. Right, so that's a very high-level view of some of my own anxieties around progress and visualization. But again, I kind of want to point out it's perfectly possible to construct a field without any interest in scientific progress whatsoever and still get useful things done. Right, so to that end, I'm going to present you with 3 potential futures of academic visualization that don't rely on a notion of scientific progress. Right, this is kind of a psychoanalytical exercise as well. So think about which of these models you find personally, interesting or discomforting, and why. Right, so the first is Viz just as an art exhibition, right? So instead of reviewers, we have curators and judges. Right? So we're not doing scientific progress, we're instead building up these personal positions and themes and technical skills. Right? The second model is that of sort of like a Victorian-style explorers club. We'd go off on our exhibitions in the deep heart of our respective disciplines, and then we'd meet once a year to see, swap interesting stories. Right? So we might individually learn things, but there's no need to build up a cohesive whole of everything we've learned as a unit. We're just telling interesting anecdotes. And then the last is sort of an apprenticeship model. So the job of the visualization student is to learn the technical art of designing visualizations. They work at the hand of a particular craftsman or lineage of craftsmen. And so as a student, you'd learn by doing, but we wouldn't actually expect what you built to be very good, at least at first, right? At least, or even publishable, right? It would just be part of the learning process. And then once you know how to build visualizations, you would go out into the wider world. So with that, that's the end of my talk. I must again tell you, I am an individual weirdo. And what I was worried about when I asked these questions and read over the answers may have very little to do with what you are worried about or even find interesting. So I encourage you to read and answer the questions yourself. At the very least, it's fun to go through the answers and try to guess which senior person said what and why. So you can argue with them instead of me. All right, so I will take the questions.
Great. Well, we did have one provocations in Slido, but I think you addressed it, wanting to know if progress is necessary. But let me ask you a question then. If you had a magic wand and you could suddenly make there be some really significant viz research that you currently feel like is missing, what is your magic wish?
I think I kind of alluded to it, but I have sort of a soft spot in my heart for this was a workshop last year, human data interaction. So when a visualization enters an organization, it's not just you looking at a bar chart for 5 seconds, but a bunch of people looking at lots of bar charts for years. What does that do, right? How does that function? How do we design for these kinds of longitudinal uses? How do we design for thinking with visualizations, not just perceiving visualizations? I mean, people are obviously engaged in that work, but if there was like a single name that I could point to and talk about, I think that would be really cool.
Thanks.
Hey, Michael, great talk. I'm really curious. I like the way you set up the Ouroboros as well as the special sauce, and I'm wondering, what if the Ouroboros is our special sauce?
Okay, so if I don't know if the Zoom folks can hear that question, but it was essentially like, maybe the Ouroboros isn't bad, maybe it's good, right? Like the fact that we aren't experts in running studies, but also maybe aren't super engaged practitioners in applied fields, maybe that's okay, or even like the special thing that we are. So in one of the tabs I was desperately trying to hide when I pulled my slides up, I had Herb Simon's Science of the Artificial, right, which talks about some of these very issues, right? And I that's okay, right? Like we're doing technical work, but I also don't think it's an excuse, right? Like if we're in the service position where we are running design studies to help people, presumably with real problems, then we should be doing a good job. And simultaneously, if we're out there and we're trying to say we have observed something new and true about how humans perceive things in the wild, we should be doing a good job of measuring that too. So it doesn't let us off the hook, but it it does position us maybe in a niche that other people aren't.
Okay, and one super last question. If you could choose any of your 3 futures that you pitched, which one would you choose?
I choose the art one. I think the art one is more fun. And VisApp, I think, opens soon, so you can see a glimpse of that future for yourself.
Good plug. Great. Thanks.